After sitting down with a classmate in the auditorium while there was a free moment, George asked, "Why are you so sad, Oliver? Is something wrong?" He looked at him with vacant eyes and said, "Nothing. Family troubles. I found out that my father lied to me for years. You have to admit, it's a very unpleasant discovery." George put aside his backpack and spoke. "Don't rush to condemn your father. Maybe he had no other choice, or maybe he did what he did without wishing you harm. It's hard to judge whether it's right or wrong. You have to know all the circumstances and reasons first, and then draw conclusions." Oliver pulled out of his pocket a childhood photo of his father seeing him off to first grade and said grudgingly, "Now he's been lying to me since these very years. Not just now, and I want to understand why Dad did it." The other students began to enter the auditorium, and the conversation had to be interrupted. Only 3 hours later, when they had finished their classes, they continued to talk again, but in a nearby cafe, where they liked to go for a cup of delicious coffee. They sat down at the table and continued their conversation. "You know, George, I don't have a mother, and I was only raised by my father and grandmother. I started asking questions about my mother pretty early on. Seeing that all my peers had a mother and I didn't, while I was little, my father told me that my mother was very sick and she was no longer with us. I didn't really know what she was talking about, of course, but it was at least an explanation. The older I got, the more I wondered why we had never been to my mother's grave. Dad started to deny it again, but then confessed what had really happened. It turned out that Mom had abandoned me and Dad, just like that, silently taking her things and leaving. Of course I believed it. How else could it be? Dad is the unquestioned authority, and I did not even have a single doubt. With that, I lived with a grudge against my mother, and sometimes I had the thought of finding her. But after listening to me, my father asked a single question. 'And why do you need it, son?' Indeed, why? And so recently we had a gathering of relatives at our house. We don't get together that often, just a couple of times a year. Dad's cousin, pretty drunk, took me aside and started mumbling that I didn't know the truth and that my mom was missing for a reason. My father turned out to be a scoundrel and did a mean thing to her, as my mother was a wonderful person. I tried to ask him for more details, but I didn't find anything else." George brought the cup of coffee he had just brought to him. "Here, wet your throat, because you're starting to wheeze." "Well, what does that make you? You get some information from a relative, but essentially nothing of substance, and now you think your father cheated you? Look, Oliver, this is all questionable. It's probably just drunken nonsense and gossip, nothing more. How do you even believe that?" Oliver wanted to contradict him, but George wouldn't let him. No, wait. I haven't finished. Your father, William, is a very respected man. And don't you know how much effort and money he puts into your life? I don't know why you would suddenly believe this relative who may just have had a grudge against her and wanted to get back at your father this way. And Oliver suddenly wondered, maybe George is right, and I suspected my father of deception for nothing. Suddenly his phone rang, and his thinking had to be interrupted. "Yeah, hi? Isabella? Sure. I'll meet you at the old place." William muttered into the phone and then hung up. Looking at his cheerful face, George slyly asked, "Is this the same girl you met a week ago? Well, you're a sly one, Oliver. You should at least introduce her to your best friend." However, meeting this wary grace, he added, "Come on. It's not like I'm going to beat her off. It would just be a lot more fun to go out with company." Nodding in agreement, Oliver replied, "Maybe some other time. Definitely not today." George continued, "What about your father? Does he know you're dating Isabella?" Oliver turned sullen, but answered, "Not yet. But I'll be sure to tell him. And we've only been dating for a week, and now until this situation is cleared up, I don't want to tell him anything at all." George finished his coffee and said, "Okay, friend. I have to go home. As soon as you think about inviting me to your company, call me." With a wave of the hand, Oliver ordered another cup of coffee and 2 cakes. Now he could think about what to do next. Had his father been deceiving him all these years? He had blindly believed that his mother had abandoned him and taken off in an unknown direction. And the most interesting thing was that all of this time, no one in this inner circle had even tried to challenge this version. And now that he's a grown man, suddenly a relative shows up and starts to be frank? True, they still could not have a thorough conversation, but what he found out raised a storm of doubts in his soul. As he pondered how he could get to the truth, Oliver remembered his grandmother. After all, she had always treated him favorably and was unlikely to refuse a truthful conversation. Above all, however, a date with Isabella, especially since they had already made arrangements. Ordering a cab, he was in the city park 20 minutes later. This was where they most often spent their free time. Soon the girl herself, who had captured his heart, appeared. A graceful female figure approached the guy. "How good is she? She's a wonder of a girl," said Oliver to himself. Isabella sat down on the bench, slightly out of breath. "Hi, Oliver. Are you okay?" the girl asked. The guy replied, "Yeah, why do you ask?" The girl smiled and added, "I don't know. It must have sounded like you sounded upset." About the misunderstanding with his father, he deliberately did not say because he did not really know what was the truth and what was a lie, and it was all the more unnecessary for Isabella to know about unpleasant family secrets. Hugging her shoulders, Oliver continued, "You'd better tell me, how was your day? What was interesting, or was it the same, no change?" Isabella smiled back. "In our beauty salon, only customers can surprise you with something, if that's what you wanted to hear." Oliver furrowed his brow, as if offended by something. "Yes, you can't argue with that, especially since the customer is always right. By the way, why did you decide to work there? You said yourself that you have a pedagogical education. Teachers and educators are in demand now, and these professions are much more useful than a simple hairdresser." Isabella took Oliver with a certain amount of humor. "I'm not arguing, but imagine if your hair grew all the way to your heels. How would you act?" "Exactly. You'd come to us anyway, because your hair is in the way. But seriously, I really love my job, and I treat it as art. And it's very necessary for people." As they talked, Oliver could barely contain himself from accidentally blabbing about his personal problems. He trusted Isabella and believed that there should be no secrets between them. They got up from the bench and walked along the alley. When they saw the ice cream kiosks, Oliver suggested buying some ice cream and going for a stroll. Isabella agreed, and in a couple of minutes they were enjoying a chocolate ice cream and watching the ducks swimming in the pond. There was nothing sweeter than spending time with the person that you thought was your soulmate on a warm, sunny day. Even though that they had only recently begun to meet, a certain spark of love had already flashed between them. While they were eating ice cream, the two lovers reached the end of the park. Looking at her watch, Isabella said excitedly, "I completely forgot. I have to get home right away. We're going to have guests tonight, and we have to hurry, or they'll be offended that I'm not home. Can you walk me to the bus stop?" Oliver didn't mind, especially since he was in a hurry to visit someone else. Now he was going to see his grandmother. She was the only person who could shed light on the family mystery. Well, and if she was no help at all, Oliver was determined to go to his uncle and get the truth out of him at all costs. 10 minutes later, the right bus arrived and Isabella kissed Oliver on the cheek and stepped inside. She waved through the window and immediately sat down in a vacant seat. From there, he saw her back, until the bus drove a decent distance away. After buying some of his grandmother's favorite sweets on the way, Oliver went into the entryway and climbed to the 3rd floor, careful not to make any noise. He knocked on the door. After a few seconds, he heard footsteps and his grandmother's voice. "I'm coming, I'll get it." Seeing her grandson on the doorstep, Caroline was a little confused. "Oh, Oliver, I wasn't expecting you. Well, come in. There's no need to stand in the doorway. Go straight to the kitchen and I'll put the kettle on." While his grandmother was closing the door behind him, he had already poured the brew into mugs and turned on the electric kettle. Seated at the table across from her grandson, Caroline squinted one eye and asked cautiously, "Oliver, how are you doing? You don't often come by in the middle of the week like this." He nervously ran a hand through his hair and answered, "You know, Grandma, I'm tormented by questions that Dad doesn't want to answer or pretends that he doesn't know anything. With a shrug, Granny said cautiously, "Then I can hardly help you either if William isn't aware of it." Oliver seems to have anticipated this response. "I know there's more to my mother's disappearance than that. Or rather, my father's brother told me about it. Really, no details, but I think you have something to say. I guess you've had enough of leading your own grandson astray." Caroline even flinched, as if she had been caught in a crime. No, Oliver. I don't know much, and William has probably already explained it all to you." And that's a twist Oliver had foreseen, so he started on the other side. "Then I'll try to find her myself, no matter what, and if I'm lucky, I'll find out the whole truth." His grandmother jumped up from her chair and went into the room, and when she came back, she put the picture on the table in front of him. "That's all I have left of your mother. She did leave the family, but not of her own free will. William forced her to do it. I'm sorry I kept quiet for so long, but I guess there's no point in hiding it now." Oliver learned from his grandmother that his father, when he first started living with his mother, had been a common laborer. It was only later, with her help, that he became well-connected and got a good job. "The more money your father got, the worse he treated his wife. They couldn't get along at all. Not a day went by without scandal and scolding. The quiet, modest Molly was clearly no longer happy with your father. He loved you, on the other hand, with no memory of it." In the end, as his grandmother admitted, Molly, Oliver's mother's name, was no longer needed, and William simply kicked her out of the house. The divorce proceeded quickly, leaving his wife without money, without a place to live, and worst of all, without a son. "The corrupt judges ruled that you would be better off with your father. William even got a restraining order against dating, and he threatened Molly himself that he would put her in an asylum if she tried to see her son." Oliver was only 3 years old at the time, and naturally he remembered nothing. Carefully hiding the picture, Oliver said, "Well, now at least I know her name and what she looks like." After finishing his tea, Oliver thanked his grandmother for her hospitality and left. Outside, he pulled out the photo again and thought to himself, "We should get George involved in the search. He's good at it." But before that, Oliver wanted to have a frank talk with his father. After all, it turns out that the relative was telling the truth, and his own father was really hiding the truth. Inside, everything was burning. His thoughts were confused. It seemed that such a familiar, so understandable world just collapsed. His father turned out to be a scoundrel, and his mother, whom he had considered a traitor all his life, turned out to be an unhappy victim. Oliver decided to walk home in order to calm down and clear his thoughts. He walked past the store and out of the corner of his eye noticed an old woman who was leaning against the wall. She tried to call for help from passers-by, gulping for air with her mouth, but the severe pain in her chest prevented her from doing so. Oliver barely had time to grab her by the sleeve. "What's the matter with you?" the guy asked. "The pill's in the black bag, little pocket on the side," the woman squeezed out somehow. The guy quickly found the medicine and gave her the pill and offered to walk her to the bench. "Let me help you. Take your time. Catch your breath. You don't have a face on you at all. Maybe I should call the emergency medical service. You don't look so good," Oliver asked excitedly. The old woman shook her head in response. "Don't, son. It'll all go away now. Thank you for helping me. I'm going on a visit, so I packed a bag full of presents. Of course, I got tired right away, so now I'm just taking it easy, son. If you're not in a hurry, you can walk with me for a while, and then I'll somehow get there myself." Taking the heavy bags from her, Oliver said, "All right, but I'll take you all the way to the entrance. By the way, why didn't you call your family to meet you?" After patting herself in her pockets, the old woman replied sadly, "I would love to, but my memory fails me and I left my phone at home." The guy wanted to call them from his cell phone, but his grandmother asked him not to. "Don't let it be a surprise." Nodding in response, Oliver continued walking with the bags in one hand and supporting the old woman with the other. On the way, they hardly spoke. except that Oliver asked her periodically how she was feeling. And then the old woman suddenly stopped on her own and looked intently into the eyes of her savior. "Are you thinking about something hard? I can see right through people, and you've got a rock on your soul." Oliver didn't answer right away, but he did. "You're right. I wanted to find my mother 20 years ago. She disappeared. My father says she left us, but I have serious doubts about it." The old woman sighed. "If fate wills, you will surely meet, and who knows, maybe very soon." The old woman pointed to the house and said, "Well, here we are to the house, son, and if you were worried that I didn't have the strength, I would go to the ends of the earth for the sake of my loved ones. Why don't you stop by? You've done a good deed. You've helped a pensioner. It's a shame not to give you some tea." Oliver thought for a while, but then agreed. "Okay, but I won't be long because I have a meeting with my father ahead of me." Once again, after looking at him, the old woman mouthed, "Here, drink our delicious tea and your soul will be at peace in a moment. And you won't think so badly of your father. I can promise you that." Once up on the second floor, the old lady rang the doorbell and they waited for the door to open. As soon as the door opened, Oliver was stunned. Isabella was standing in front of him, and behind her, a woman whose feature reminded him of someone. He could hardly contain his excitement. He took the very same photo out of his pocket and nearly lost his mind. No doubt it was the woman in the photo. Much younger, but certainly her. Unable to control his emotions, Oliver cried, and all he could think was, "It can't be! It can't be!" Mother and son stared at each other in a daze. Unable to look away, Isabella wrapped her arms around Oliver's face and asked excitedly, "What's the matter with you? You're white as a sheet." Pointing his hand at the woman, he said, "I can't believe it. I'm sorry, but we can't see each other anymore. It's a shame." Unaware of what was going on, Isabella turned around. "Mom, how does he know you?" The woman stepped forward and, taking the picture from his hands, answered with tears in her eyes, "I guess fate has tried and brought him to me. It's my little boy, Oliver. My goodness, how you've grown." Isabella immediately frantically babbled. "But how? And why didn't you tell me anything about it?" An old woman intervened in the conversation. "And really, Molly, what's going on here? You know this guy and we're in the dark, so let's get to the apartment. There's nothing to be stuck on the landing." Oliver walked to the kitchen, dragging his feet, and sat down on a chair. Isabella approached him again. "I'm sorry, I didn't know this was going to happen. Honestly. And I didn't hide anything from you. Molly is not my own mother. Although I love her like my own mother, we are not brother and sister." They sat down in the kitchen for a long time, telling each other that what had happened to them during those long 20 years of separation. Everything her grandmother told her was true, which Oliver found very hard to accept. Molly told her of her life and how she lived in rented apartments, how she longed for her son, and how she came to the house to see her son at least from afar. 2 years later, she met a good man who, after his wife's death, was raising their daughter Isabella. They married and have lived in love and harmony all these years. But Molly could never be happy without her son. She hoped for a reunion, and here it happened. Clenching his fists with all of his might, Oliver muttered, "I'll remember everything. He'll pay me for everything." It was only the wisdom of his mother, who had been absent from his life for so long, that kept him from doing something stupid. Oliver listened to Molly and talked quite peacefully with his father. However, he stood his ground and thought he did the right thing. In the end, Oliver temporarily moved in with his girlfriend Isabella, so as to not go to extremes and make trouble. The relationship between them only grew stronger, and as it turned out later, he was even going to propose to her. As for his father, for the time being, Oliver does not want to put up with him. He can't forgive the fact that he once robbed him of his mother, nor has Molly forgiven her ex-husband. A mother's separation from her child. What could be scarier? But she hopes that Oliver will forgive her father someday. They are, after all, kindred people.